So, you've just started your first game of Dungeons & Dragons, and you've got to the point where the DM asks you, what class do you want to pick? In this video, we're going to be covering the basics of the fighter, from level 1 to level 5. We'll go through which feats you should choose, which races work well with it, and all of the abilities and skills, and generally what your role in the party will be. This is part of the D&D Bootcamp playlist, where I go through all of the basics of what to do when you're playing your first game of Dungeons & Dragons. So if you have any questions, leave them down below, and I'll be happy to try and answer them. Now, without further ado, let's get started with the video. Your main role as the fighter is to be in the front line of combat. You're tanking hits and defending the wizard, the rogue, and the cleric. Now, the cleric can tank a couple of hits with its armor, but generally speaking, you're going to be the most physical character of the group. If there's any feats of strength or any athletic checks, then you'll be the first port of call. I would argue that the fighter is the best class for beginners, because it is not very complicated, it's streamlined, it can take a couple of hits, and if you're a fighter, you don't have to worry about rules and mechanics, you can just jump into combat. And personally, it's my favourite class to play. Now, if there are a lot of skill checks, you should be leaving it to someone like the rogue. Your cleric will be healing you, and your wizard will be providing long distance damage. But you're going to be the one that's at the front of the dungeon. You're going to be the one that's battling off hordes of enemies and defending everyone else. Now, there are three main flavours of fighter, in my opinion. There's the fighter that has a sword and shield, the one that has a ranged weapon like a bow and arrow, and then there's the fighter that has a two-handed sword, a real brute of a character. As a fighter, you'll be a master at arms. Unlike a lot of the other classes, the fighter has access and the ability to use any weapon in combat. A lot of the other classes can only use simple weapons, but you have access to martial weapons as well. There are three main types of damage you can deal as a fighter, as bludgeoning, piercing, and slashing damage. They each have their own benefits and drawbacks, which we'll get into later in the video. Out of the skills for the fighter, you get acrobatics, animal handling, athletics, history, insight, intimidation, perception, and survival. I would recommend, as a new player, going for perception and athletics. Perception is one of the most commonly used skills in the game, and if you're going to be at the front of the party when you're going through a dungeon, then you'll be the one spotting traps. That should be the rogue speciality, but the fighter having a good perception check is always a nice bonus to have. Don't think of these picks as a concrete decision. You can choose whichever skills you want, because you have access to two of these skills. Go with what you think your character would use the most. When you start out, you have access to leather armor, which is classed as light armor, or chainmail. Now, depending on what sort of fighter you want to be, leather armor and a longbow is more a ranged fighter. That means you'd be going for a high dexterity. If you pick the chainmail and a martial weapon, you're going for a more melee-focused fighter. Also at level 1, the fighter gets to choose its own fighting style. Now, this is fairly unique to the fighter. I think there's one other class that has it in the ranger. But we'll go through the fighting styles and what the benefits and drawbacks are. If you choose archery, it's of course good for ranged weapons, but if you take the archery fighting style, you're missing out on the more melee focused ones, so take that into consideration. Defense is a solid one, you get a bonus to your armor class, but it's a bit boring. It's a very dependable one. If you're going for a more tanky build, then go for defense. Dueling is a strange pick. If you have a melee weapon in one hand, you should be really thinking about having a shield in the other. This will really help you go one-on-one with people and add some extra damage. Now, the great weapon fighting style, used for the two-handed weapons, the claymores, the giant clubs, the battle axes, and if you want to go for a more savage fighter, then this is the one to pick. The next option is protection. Now, this is less used, but it does have its niche uses. Personally, if you're going to be a more protective fighter, then I would go for defense over protection. And lastly, we have two-weapon fighting. This gets a little bit complicated for new players, but essentially, you attack with your main weapon as an action, and then as a bonus action, you can use a weapon in your second hand to attack again, once a turn. If you're doing a bonus action for a second weapon attack, there will be a little bit of a disadvantage. But with the 2-weapon fighting style, you'll negate that, and you'll be able to add your attack modifier. Also at level 1, you gain access to Second Wind. Now this just reinforces the fact that you're going to be taking the brunt of the damage, and at low levels this is a fantastic option. As you get to later levels, this skill is not as powerful, but it's always helpful to have it in your back pocket. If you're getting low on health, if you're down to single digits, then use Second Wind. Don't be afraid to use it because you get it back on a short or a long rest. At level 2, you gain access to the fighter's most powerful technique, Action Surge. When you declare you're using Action Surge, you're going to be able to take 2 actions at once in one turn. Now, the most basic level, you can say you attack and then you attack again, but this is slightly boring. It's dependable, but other people will be using an attack and then using their second action to help the rogue and give them advantage on the next hit, or potentially running away or running towards an enemy to try and kite them away from the wizard. Action Surge is only limited by your imagination, but once you get to level 5, this is when it really kicks in. But we'll get to level 5 in a moment. Now when you get to level 3, you have the option of choosing a subclass, which is like taking the fighter and then further specializing in a specific way of playing. In the player's handbook there are 3 options. You have the champion, the Eldritch Knight, and the Battlemaster. Now the Eldritch Knight is a little bit more complicated, and it's like a combination of a wizard and a fighter, and you can cast spells, you can hit people with your sword at the same time, but the problem is, if you want to specialize as an Eldritch Knight, when you're first making your character, you should make sure you have a high intelligence, because that's the skill you're going to be using to cast your spells. So if you don't roll super high stats for your strength, constitution, and intelligence, then I would avoid the Eldritch Knight. But if you're feeling confident and you have a good grasp of the rules and understand how the system works, then go for an Eldritch Knight. The second choice is a Battlemaster. Now the Battlemaster has a list of different options you can choose, and once you've chosen them you are hard committed to using these, but they do offer a bit of versatility that some of the other subclasses don't. So if you want to take your time and read through them, the options are out in the player's handbook. The third option is the champion. If you're wanting a more streamlined experience in Dungeons and Dragons, you're not worried about combat as much as you want to do the role-playing and exploration, then I would pick the champion. It has simple, easy to understand mechanics. At 3rd level, when you roll your dice to attack, if you roll a 19 or a 20, you get a critical hit, instead of just rolling a 20 for a crit. Now this sounds good on paper, but it gets even better. If someone wants to do the mathematics down in the comments, I'd be more than happy for you to do it. But you have 19 and a 20 to get a critical hit, and then you combine that with Action Surge, which lets you take 2 actions in one turn, and then you combine that with a level 5 ability to attack twice in every action. That means you're going to be attacking 4 times in one round. You're improving your chances of scoring a crit. So that shows you the real power of this class. Now, if you're interested in some of the other subclasses that are available in other books, you can find a link down in the description or on the pinned comment to all the other fighter subclasses I've covered in detail in these other videos. But they're more advanced settings, so we're just going through the basics from 1 to 5 today. At level 4, you gain access to choosing a feat or improving your ability score. Now, the fighter is unique in the sense that you can improve your ability scores and gain more feats than any other class. I would recommend, if you don't have a comprehensive grasp of the rules, you would go for something more streamlined and upgrade your strength or your constitution, depending on if you want to deal damage or take more damage. But if you're feeling a little bit more spicy, you can pick a feat. There's a whole list of feats in the player's handbook, and then there's additional feats in Tasha's Cauldron of Everything, and I believe they may be in Xanathar's Guide as well. I'm not 100% sure, but check it out. And lastly, at level 5, you can attack twice. Doesn't sound like much, but every time you take an attack action, you can hit twice. You combine that with having a +1 weapon at this point of the game, you're going to be dealing damage more consistently, and it ties in back with the champion's ability to score a critical hit on a 19 or a 20. Now, going over some of the feats you have access to at level 4, some of my recommendations are the crossbow expert if you want to try and specialise in ranged attacks and you have good dexterity. Again, if you have dexterity, you could go for a defensive duelist feat, which lets you add your proficiency bonus to your armor class instead of using a shield. If you're going for the maximum amount of attacks possible, then dual wielder is a great option. But I want to say that if you're specialising in fighter, Great Weapon Master is a fantastic option. It pairs up beautifully with the champion subclass, because when you score a critical hit with a melee weapon and the creature is reduced to 0 hit points, you can make another attack as a bonus action. With a two-handed weapon, that's quite the advantage. If you make an attack with a heavy weapon, you can choose to take a penalty, and if it hits, you get a massive boost to your damage. So this is not the best thing to pick if you're going up against a lot of small creatures, but if you're going one-to-one with a giant or a owlbear, then Great Weapon Master will come in handy. When choosing a race for the fighter, out of the player's handbook, if you're going for a more strength-based character, I would recommend the Dragonborn or the Half-Orc. They both get a plus to their strength. The Half-Orc gets Relentless Endurance, which makes sure that it won't go down when it reaches 0 hit points. And the Dragonborn has access to a breath weapon, which really helps out when you're fighting a lot of smaller enemies at low levels. It can wipe out a whole encounter quite easily. If you're going for a more dexterity-based fighter, the two main options are the Elf and the Halfling. Now, the Elf does seem a little bit more respectable, but I would go with the Halfling, because you get the natural advantage of having the dexterity boosted, but you also have the lucky ability. If you ever roll a 1, it gets cancelled out. If you're going for a more tanky character, go for the Half-Orc or the Dwarf. The Dwarf gets a natural boost to Constitution, and depending on the type of Dwarf, you might get a boost to your Strength as well. As covered previously, the Half-Orc is great because it has Strength, it has Relentless Endurance, and Savage Attacks. It's almost tailor-made to be a fighter. With regards to backgrounds, the natural fit would be a soldier. It matches up with your strengths and your more athletic abilities. But if you want to be more of a pit fighter, for example, you could always take the entertainer background. If you're feeling a bit more nimble and dexterous, check out the sailor background, but there is a pirate variant of the sailor which works quite well. Still not sure about the fighter? Then check out one of the other videos where I go through the cleric, the wizard, or the rogue. Thanks for watching, and I'll speak to you next time.